Buddy, it's Monday, February the 8th, 2026. GW Law School seems to be monopolizing the Keen on America show these days. A few days ago, we had Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, a professor at GW, talking about his new book, Your Data Will Be Used Against You, a kind of libertarian defense against the Leviathans of Silicon Valley. And now we have another GW professor, Jonathan Turley, who, like Ferguson, has a new book out. It's called Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. It's just out. His last book, many of you will be familiar with, The Indispensable Right, was a bestseller. I expect this one will be too. Jonathan is joining us from his home in the Washington, D.C. area. Jonathan, would it be fair to say that your new book, Rage and the Republic, focuses on the uniqueness of the American Revolution, which, of course, we are celebrating the 250th year anniversary this year?
Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you for having me on your program. And it does indeed look at what are the factors and the personalities and events that came together to create this unique republic 250 years ago. And that first half of the book looks at two revolutions, the American and French revolutions, and actually follows much of the journey of Thomas Paine, who is one of two central figures who played a role in both revolutions, the other being Lafayette. And the first half of the book sort of tries to figure out why the American Revolution went on to become the longest and most successful democracy, and the French Revolution went on to become the Reign of Terror. And what the book suggests is that the difference were these precautions that James Madison put together in the Constitution. You know, Thomas Paine was the righteous rage of the American Revolution. He may have been the truest revolutionary of the American Revolution. And it was James Madison who was sort of the pious logic. You know, Paine knew what it would take to move a people to revolution. And then Madison knew what it would take to move a revolution to a republic. And it was the combination of those two sort of mindsets and frankly, two geniuses that produced this republic. And then the second half of the book looks forward as to whether that republic can survive in the 21st century. And it looks at everything from the combination of robotics and AI, which I go into some depth on, and the potential of a massive loss of jobs, as well as global governance and the rise of what I call the class of new Jacobins.
Well, we'll get to that class of new Jacobins in a few minutes. Jonathan, is your analysis then, it sounds to me as if your analysis of the American Revolution is somewhat Burkean, this 1-2 punch of Paine and then Madison forcing Paine's anger and righteousness into law. You're a professor of law. Is that fair? Is your analysis of the uniqueness of the American Revolution Burkean? Burke, of course, being the greatest of all critics of the French Revolution and particularly of Jacobinism.
Well, I go into some depth about the debate between Paine and Burke. I'm known as more of a Madisonian scholar, and the book certainly embraces what Madison was arguing. What I find fascinating about Thomas Paine, and he is the most interesting historical figure I've ever researched or written about, is that Paine was a remarkable individual, a true genius. But he did not agree with Madison's auxiliary precautions, as he called them, because he believed more in direct democracy. And when he went to the French Revolution, he pursued that with Jacobins. He wanted a unicameral legislature. He wanted to sort of strip away a lot of those barriers for the public to express themselves through legislation. And it came damn near to killing him. That is, Paine came within 24 hours of being guillotined. And it was just an accident that he wasn't beheaded. But he came to realize that Madison was right. And what the rightness of Madison was in the view that democracies devour themselves. That at the beginning of the book starts by quoting a Frenchman from the Revolution, who said that revolutions like Saturn devour their own.
Yeah, and of course, there's that famous novel, "The Gods Must Have Their Blood."
That's right. And Paine watched that happen in France. The Jacobins, all the leadership of the Jacobins, except for a couple of notable exceptions, all fell under what was called the razor of the Republic. They all were devoured by the revolution.
And of course, the razor was not just metaphorical, it was the guillotine. I'm guessing, Jonathan, that the bad guy in your narrative, at least when it comes to France, is Robespierre. Does he speak for everything that went wrong with the French Revolution?
Well, I go into depth with Robespierre, and I talk about him in the second half as well. We've been talking about the new Jacobins. What has to be remembered is that Robespierre was a lawyer. And when he began, he spoke about the rights of man, about due process. If you had heard him and read him in the early days, you would have thought he was an ACLU lawyer. And this
I'm guessing, do you get the Robespierre types in your classes at GW? I'm sure you shut them up, Jonathan.
Well, the thing about it is I not only talk about Robespierre, but also figures like Marat, journalists, lawyers, professors, aristocrats, who began in the same way, but were corrupted over time to the point that Robespierre eventually said that terror is virtue. He came to totally embrace the execution of those that disagree with you. And the book talks about how this was sort of a Rousseauian revolution in that sense. The Jacobins loved Rousseau and his idea of the general will. And this was another way of saying direct democracy, that if you unleash the general will of the populace, that it can only come to good because people are good. It was a very naive.
Yeah, and of course, Rousseau invented the modern concept of authenticity and the self and all the rest of that. Were there any good guys in your analysis of the French Revolution? Danton, of course, comes to mind. Who got the French Revolution in France? Tocqueville, I'm guessing, from your point of view.
Well, the top villain will definitely have to go to Robespierre and Marat and Hébert and a few others. But Danton was no angel, of course. He signed off on the executions. Eventually, he joined the Girondins, which was the sort of moderate Jacobin wing, but they had blood on their hands as well. And then ultimately, of course, he was executed. It was an interesting, many of the good ones were, of course, executed because they were good.
The gods must have their blood, Jonathan.
That's right.
In your historical narrative, the way when I was a student in England, the way we were brought up in terms of our analysis of these comparative revolutions is we didn't begin with the French or the American revolutions. We began with the glorious English Revolution. What's your analysis when it comes to rage and the Republic of the Republican Revolution, or what in part was a Republican Revolution in England, the Cromwellian Revolution, which of course was also manifested by a degree of rage? What was different from the American Revolution?
Well, this is a book about revolutions. I do talk about the English Revolution. All revolutions require rage. All these nations are not just the progeny of revolution, but the result of rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was, after all. It was rage. And you have to move a country to rage. That's why Thomas Paine was so important. That's why he's called the penman of the revolution. That's why he's so extraordinary. I mean, he arrived in this country barely alive after a voyage. He had to be carried off a ship in Philadelphia. That was 2 years. Just 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. In 2 years, he went from being an entire and complete failure in everything he had ever done, every job, every marriage he had, to being the penman of the American Revolution. But the American Revolution was the first true Enlightenment revolution, not to downplay the English rebellion, but
you don't consider it a revolution? You call it a rebellion, Jonathan?
Well, I don't mean
their king.
No, I didn't actually mean much by the change in nouns, but the American Revolution was a direct outgrowth of Enlightenment ideas. And the Declaration of Independence is largely an Enlightenment document. It actually doesn't talk about democracy, it talks about liberty. It never mentions democracy. And in that sense, it was a fascination for people around the world. They talked about these Americans like they were a brand new species. And it sort of goes when Locke said in the beginning, all was America. It was not just that this was an untamed land. It was this notion that this was a country that was starting anew without the sort of calcified structures, classes of Europe. And I talk in the book about a Frenchman who wrote under the name Farmer John, who had a great line in a very popular book in Europe. And he asked, what then is this American? And it was a very profound question. What then is this American? The Europeans wanted to know how this could happen, why it happened. And actually the French modeled originally the revolution on the United States, but then refused to create those protections and precautions. They wanted the revolution, but not what came with it.
Jonathan, what about the alternative narrative of the American Revolution? I'm sure you're not particularly keen on it. The idea of the appropriation of indigenous land, the history of slavery in terms of the American Revolution. Are there contradictions, especially when it comes to Paine? Paine, of course, was not an admirer of slavery, perhaps even of capitalism. What about the alternative narratives? Do you just dismiss them?
No, I don't. In fact, I talk about those. The inherent contradictions are glaring. I actually talk about it also in terms of why Thomas Paine was so unpopular. He had the distinction of being pursued for prosecutions in all three nations where he claimed citizenship for sedition. He was the ultimate contrarian. But there was more to that, as I say in the book, that there's a reason why people preferred figures like Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Paine. Jefferson was tall and erudite, classically trained, well-educated, and a slave owner. Thomas Paine was vehemently against slavery. And that, I think, contributed to his being an outlier. I mean, so there were others that were against slavery, but it was this glaring contradiction that Paine himself did not have, which is why I think he's such a redeeming character, even if he had very few friends. I quote Benjamin Franklin's daughter as saying, it would have been better if he had died right after Common Sense. And I note in the book, she was one of his friends. So, it's an amazing thing about Paine. He died virtually friendless, of course, penniless, which was the problem he had his entire life. But slavery is one of those big issues that is looming here in terms of the contradictions, particularly if you are an Enlightenment revolution, to deny those freedoms to so many who are enslaved by you. And that book does talk about that.
It's interesting you bring up Franklin. We've done a number of shows on him over the years. Franklin, of course, was the reverse of Paine in the sense that he had many friends, both in the United States and Europe. Is he your fourth man, Jonathan? We've got Madison, we've got Jefferson, we've got Paine, who's the kind of, I don't know what you'd call him. It sounds to me like a kind of anti-hero, simultaneously hero and anti-hero in your narrative. What about Franklin?
Well, Paine is remarkably and delightfully complex. I quote in the book, I'm a film noir nut and I drive my children crazy because I have to have something playing in the background when I work. And it's always a black and white film noir film, which probably scarred my children to a terrible extent.
I hope so.
Yeah. And but the greatest line ever uttered in any film noir was delivered by Fred Murray, who turned, after finding out that the femme fatale had finally lied to him again, as well as to her husband, and she was incapable of telling the truth. He goes to the door, she begs him to stay, and he turns and says, I love you so much, I only wish I liked you. And I think with Thomas Paine, for those of us who have spent a lot of time with him in these histories, We all love him. We just wish we liked him. He had this person that was hard to like, because in many ways he was brilliant about humanity, but he was clueless about humans.
Well,
And
that's the classic conservative critique of leftists. For people who are just listening, Jonathan is a very formal fellow. He's dressed in a suit and tie. Is there a wannabe Thomas Paine in you, Jonathan? Do you sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and fantasize of being Thomas Paine?
I can't say I fantasize of being Thomas Paine, but
what about your wife? Would she like you to be Thomas Paine?
Oh, I don't think anyone would want to live with Thomas Paine. You know, the interesting thing you mentioned, Benjamin.
Be exciting though for a few minutes, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but you know, it's it only took a few minutes before people generally got into a fight with Thomas Paine, because he was the ultimate contrarian. And you mentioned Benjamin Franklin, who is prominently featured in the book.
And the ladies loved Franklin, and Franklin, of course, loved the ladies, especially the French ladies, I think.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that Thomas Paine had finally hit rock bottom. He had no money. He appeared before Benjamin Franklin in London without a penny, unkempt, known as a drunkard and a contrarian. But Benjamin Franklin saw something in that heap of human wreckage, which is a skill that Benjamin Franklin had. He had an eye for talent, but his greatest achievement, without question, was Thomas Paine. He was the one who paid for Thomas Paine to go to America. He was the one who wrote his son, the governor, to ask that he find a position for him. He was the one that told Thomas Paine, "You should write." And in many ways, the book looks at Thomas Paine because he may be the quintessential American. He came to this shore to reinvent himself, to become something new. And what he found was in this place that he said that there was a special something in the United States. And I think that special something is a place without limits. And he came to reinvent himself, and he did. He discovered that the most valuable thing he had was in his head. It was being Thomas Paine.
Yeah, and of course, Fitzgerald famously said, he was completely wrong on this, that there are no second chances in America. And Thomas Paine had a second chance, and then perhaps that's what America's all about. Let's get to the R word, Jonathan, rage. Are you arguing in the book that there's something uniquely American, or at least uniquely American about rage in the American Revolution? I mean, all our revolutions you've noted are driven by rage. There was a ragefulness, as you note, about Thomas Paine, and anger and a thirst for justice. What is so unique about the rage driving the American Revolution? That thirst for justice, of course, you can find not just with Robespierre, with Lenin, with Mao, with many other revolutions.
There's nothing unique about the rage in the American Revolution. That's the point of the book, that rage is a very human feeling. It's my second book that deals with the earlier book that you mentioned dealt with what I call the age of rage. And
yeah, and the subtitle of the book is Free Speech in an Age of Rage.
Yeah, but it's not our first age of rage, and it's not unique. But what was unique was the recognition of the founders. They did not want an Athenian democracy, which was an utter failure. It lasted not that very long and ended up in tyranny. They did not want what one framer called a mobocracy, that the tendency of democracies to devour themselves. So what was unique was the effort put in to create a system that could vent the pressures that would blow democracies apart, that could handle the rage. That's what was unique, not the rage itself. And
that's, of course, Madison and the other authors of the Federalist Papers. Then are you arguing that the key event perhaps in the revolution was the debate articulated in the Federalist Papers about a centralized government versus something else?
Well, what I talk about, particularly the second half of the book, in trying to identify the elements that led us to create this republic, is that we're going to need them more than ever in the 21st century. And many of those are Madisonian precautions. I do a sort of, the first half is sort of a tale of two cities. I look at Philadelphia and Paris. Both had violence in the street. This was after the American Revolution. Paris was about to get blown apart again. There was an attack called the Battle of Fort Wilson. It was actually just James Wilson's home. He came damn near close, one of the founders, to being killed by a mob. And many people died. But then it stopped in Philadelphia. That's a true miracle about it. And even though the Constitution was unpopular, it barely passed in Pennsylvania, people discovered that they had an alternative to going into the streets, and it stabilized. That's what was missing in the French Revolution. And it takes a lot when you unleash that rage. It takes a lot. Starting revolutions is not as difficult as ending one. Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, was the result of the French Revolution. But it's Bonaparte that said a revolution is an idea that has found its bayonets. The problem is to find a way to put the bayonets away when you have accomplished or articulated that idea. And that's what the French were unable to do. It required a shock to them to end the bloodletting. You talk about the figures from the French Revolution. One that I spend a lot of time on is Corday, who is this beautiful woman who killed Marat in his bathtub. And it was famous
painting, yeah.
Yes, with David, the death of Marat. David was himself a radical Jacobin, and this was sort of a propaganda piece. He had Marat laid out like a Pietà in the tub with alabaster skin. Marat was in the tub because he was covered in sores because he had a rare skin disease. And he most likely did not look quite as contented as having a knife plunged into his chest. But Corday, in many ways, was a shock to the system. Her execution was different from the rest. People found her courage, and not just her beauty, to be really sort of all-encompassing. And watching her execution was Robespierre. Next to him was Danton, both of which would soon fall under the same blade. And but Corday was, I think, one of those turning points. She was a Republican. She was not a royalist in that sense. She had seen the bloodletting and wanted to end it, but she ended it with an act of assassination.
You mentioned earlier that you're a Madison scholar. Madison, of course, is famously associated with words, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And of course, we're not. In terms of defining not being angels, was Madison's analysis that we were rageful or economically self-interested and tending towards faction, or are those in his mind the same thing?
Well, it may be in some ways the same thing. People often will ask me, it seems like Madison was a cynic, that he talked about factions and how people form factions. I always push back on that. In some ways, I consider Madison the greatest of optimists because he took us for who we are. He didn't, I always tell my students, when my students come up and say, oh, I've read the US Constitution. I just love it. It's so beautiful. I know they've never read the US Constitution because they
probably used AI to read it. They probably got a summary from AI.
The US Constitution reads like the tax code. I mean, there's nothing, but I tell them, if you want to read a beautiful Constitution, read any of the French constitutions. I mean, because they had a lot of practice because they failed so often. And but they knew how to write a constitution. They would talk about the rights of man, this horizontal view of who we are, and they would have a revolution. And the next morning they'd wake up and have that morning after feeling that you're not quite.
Jonathan, I've heard it's an interesting argument. I've heard it many times before. What's original about your argument about this distinction between the American and the French Revolution?
Well, that's really not the thrust of the book. The thrust of the book is,
so you would acknowledge it's not particularly original?
About how often the French, about the
that the American was Madisonian and the French was rooted in violence and rage and Robespierre and the guillotine.
No, the book actually does not just say that. The book looks at the French Revolution and the difference between Voltaire and Rousseau. It was famously said by one French historian that the first French Revolution was Voltairian and the second which became the Reign of Terror, which was Rousseauian. And I look at what were the contributors there, because the thrust of my book is really to sort of have some guide, a survival guide for this republic in the 21st century. And we're going to have to rely on those elements more than we have ever done before. And the concern I raise is that many of my colleagues, a lot of law professors, law deans, are calling for removing some of the very elements I identify in the book as key to why we stabilized and became so
Are you suggesting that there are Robespierres hidden in lots of law departments around the country?
I'm not saying that. In fact, in the book, I say I don't believe that any of these new Jacobins want to see, the carts roll down Pennsylvania Avenue, but neither did Robespierre when he began. The key is that you can lose control to a mobocracy if you have more direct democratic impulse, if you remove these precautions. And what concerns me is, one of the priorities is to change the Supreme Court, to pack the Supreme Court. Also to change the U.S. Senate. With the dean of Berkeley Law School has a book out saying no constitution lasts forever, and says that the U.S. Constitution is now the threat that has to be overcome.
Who's the dean of the Berkeley Law School?
Erwin Chemerinsky.
Yeah, he's been on the show. Let's fast forward. Let's get to the core of the book. Yesterday was the Super Bowl, supposedly bringing Americans together, of course, although if anything, it divided them even more, attitudes to culture and politics. Some people might be listening to this, Jonathan, and thinking, well, this guy's talking about the dangers of mobocracy, but he's on Fox News all the time. Isn't the danger of mobocracy and rage, isn't that more manifest on the right with the followers of MAGA and Trump than it is on the left in America in 2026?
I don't see how you could argue that, in the sense that there's rage on both sides. You see it all around you. Rage is a strange thing. It gives you license to say and do things you would not ordinarily say or do. But what people won't admit on either side is that they like it. It's addictive and it's contagious. I don't see any difference in that sense.
Coming back to the politicians, I know you're not a big admirer of some of the politicians on the left. You wrote something critical of Newsom, but Trump seems to capture the sort of the rageful zeitgeist of the age more than anyone else, doesn't he? I certainly don't see a rageful Trump on the left in America, or at least one who has any political skills.
Well, I'm not too sure how you could have missed that.
Well, who would be an example?
Well, you have everyone from Governor Walz to the members of Congress calling ICE Nazis, Gestapo, saying there's going to be Nuremberg trials. What do you call that if it's not?
They say that. Well, but Walz is not a
I want to correct something else. And that is, I've been critical of both sides. My students will tell you I haven't liked a president since James Madison. And so I have criticized President Trump, and when I thought he was right, I have said that as well. But there is no lock on rage today. That is a conceit that people love to say, that it's the other side, right? My rage is righteous. Their rage is dangerous. That's very much the voice of rage.
Are you raging against rage, though? It sounds as if you might be a bit.
No, because I don't think that it's the rage itself is the threatening element. We have a system that can handle rage. I testified once in Congress when one of the members asked me, you always talk to us about the framers, but people today talk like they're trying to kill each other. And I pointed out, Congressman, they were actually trying to kill each other back then. The U.S. Constitution wasn't just written for times like this. It was written during a time like this. It was designed to handle rage. I'm not afraid of the rage. What I'm afraid of is removing the elements that we need to regulate and moderate the rage. That's what can become a mobocracy. Are we a mobocracy now? No, because we have a system designed not to let that happen.
Going back to Paine, comparing the comparison of Paine, who was an itinerant Englishman who suffered a lot in his life, and Jefferson, who was an aristocrat, had a wonderful estate on Monticello, lots of slaves. even a slave wife. He had reason to be cheerful with his wine and his fancy new estate. Some people might argue in America in 2026, Jonathan, that there's all reason to be raged. Too much, more and more inequalities, more and more of a struggle to survive, to pay one's rent, anger on the streets, anger against the police, anger within the police, blah, blah, blah. Can one argue in 2026 that the rage that you fear and are critical of is almost logical, inevitable, given the economic and cultural organization of the current republic?
That's actually what I say in the book. I don't actually condemn rage as an emotion or a passion. I believe rage is something inherent during times of great economic and political change. That's not the problem. But what I am warning about in the book is how we're going to face what's coming, which I believe with AI and robotics I take the most conservative estimates on the loss of jobs from that technology. And we are looking at the possibility of a very large, static, unemployed class of individuals who would be supported by the state. And the book asks, how does that change a citizen's relationship to the state? I disagree with you, by the way, when you said that Paine was not a big fan of capitalism. I think you're wrong. And, I note in the book that, The Wealth of Nations came out the year of the Declaration of Independence. It was embraced here. It was not a huge success in Europe. It was a big success here because the founders viewed his economic theory as being the perfect companion to their political theory. And it was the combination of that that helped stabilize the system. Paine actually said many things in agreement with Smith. He was also, however, very forward-looking. He would talk about things that we would consider today to be public welfare systems. But he was actually a fairly outspoken supporter of free markets.
Yeah, and of course, Smith himself was not really Smithian in the sense that some libertarians have interpreted it. So, Jonathan, let's get to the heart of the book then. If indeed America is on the brink of a new chapter of massive ragefulness, if everyone's about to lose their jobs to AI, what would you advise? Is the solution political, economic, cultural?
I actually think the book talks about a number of elements that we have to focus on. One is we can't have a kept population. So you can't, this republic won't work if people are simply subsidized by the government. It won't work because it denies something very human about us, not just our relationship to the government. But people need to be productive. They need to have a way. One of the things the framers liked about Smith was they believed that if you weren't economically independent, you'd never truly be free. So the book talks about mistakes that we have to avoid, subsidizing industries that are going to be devastated by AI and robotics. That's usually the first tendency of politicians, is just prop up industries like that.
Or the coal industry in West Virginia.
Well, the key is to find homocentric occupations. And I talk about those to shift. But we cannot have what I call an arts and crafts population. You can't just entertain the population that will have no productive use, because human beings have to be productive, in my view.
So you're not a big fan of the abundance argument, either Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, or the more radical abundance argument out in Silicon Valley that technology will liberate us from labor. It's really Marx's German ideology argument that we'll all be free to be writers or philosophers or poets in the afternoon. You don't believe in any of that?
I don't. And I go in depth on that as to why it's important for people to be productive. I talk about the fact that, look, one of my grandfathers was a coal miner who got black lung in the mines of Ohio. The other one was a cooper. He made barrels. Neither of them liked their job. I mean, one almost killed my Italian grandfather. But if you asked him who he was, even long after he had left the mines, he said he was a coal miner. And the reason is that we are often identified with what makes us productive. That's why people come to this country to reinvent themselves, to find their own manifest
So
destiny.
they're second chances.
Yeah, and I think that this idea that we're just going to be a kept population ignores that very human need.
So I take your point, Jonathan. I'm not sure anyone would necessarily argue, but in our age where we have a winner-take-all capitalism, where we have fewer and fewer companies controlling more and more of the economy, OpenAI, Anthropic will likely do their IPOs this year. These new AI companies are controlling everything. They'll eliminate, for better or worse, willingly or consciously or otherwise, jobs. To borrow another phrase from another revolutionary, I'm sure one that you're not keen on, Lenin, what is to be done? What should happen? What are you arguing in favor of?
Well, I'm arguing in favor of preserving, trying to reduce the dependency and subsidization of the population by making wise choices as to how we support certain industries, but also to reaffirm those elements that protect liberty. And many of those elements are the ones being under attack by many folks, including many law professors. And so I try to argue as best I can that we need to preserve that more than ever. And that could be the key here, because I talk about what I call corporate feudalism, which is the rise of these major corporations and the dangers they present. Also, global governance systems like the EU, which I believe is probably the worst positioned in dealing with the problems that are coming. I believe the EU could ultimately collapse in spectacular fashion because it does not have the elements that I discuss in this book that are going to be necessary to protect individual liberty. And what happens is that when you have a system like that collapse, it's very dangerous because it often ends up in tyranny.
Yeah, I take your point, although it's not a book about the EU. But then if everything you're saying is true, and I don't think many people would disagree that people are going to lose their jobs, their ways of life, you're arguing against state intervention. You're arguing that a kept population is an unfree population, an un-American population. What becomes of the people who lose their jobs? If you're not going to give them guaranteed minimum income, which I'm sure you're against, then what are they supposed to do? Are you falling back on a kind of hard Victorianism? These people should just die on the street?
I'm not too sure why you think I'm against supporting people who don't have jobs. Of course, I'm in favor of that.
But you're against the kept population.
That's right, but there's a little room between that and leaving a population to starve. I mean, I think that we are going to have to subsidize a large population of unemployed. The question is, what will we do beyond the subsidization? And I argue against certain moves like the subsidy of failing industries, and instead shifting over to industries that will remain homocentric. There are certain types of jobs that people are still going to want a human element. In the book, I actually call them Guinan jobs, and only nerds will understand that term, because Guinan was the bartender on the Next Generation on the Enterprise and 10 Forward. And I always
you're a Star Trek person too. You got a little bit.
Well, but I always thought it was curious growing up that you had a replicator right behind Guinan that could make the perfect Romulan sunrise cocktail, and yet people would have her make it, even though that replicator could make literally the perfect cocktail.
But this is all fantasy, Jonathan. It's all very well for professors like yourself to make.
No, my point
hold on. People are going to lose their jobs, right? Over all this, you're not in favor of subsidizing coal miners or maybe lawyers because they're going to be out of work through AI. What are you suggesting? Everyone should become masseurs? I mean, give me some examples of work that you think will flourish in this age of AI, of robotics.
Well, I was getting to that. The question is, what are Guinan jobs? What are jobs that people still want a human being to do? And there's a great variety of them, from education to certain areas of medicine. I talk about how certain areas of medicine are going to be largely wiped out by AI robotics. Things like you're not going to have as many radiologists just because it's sort of silly if you can have AI do that function better. But you are going to have psychiatrists, psychologists, analysts. You're also going to have a lot of industries, particularly like education, that people are going to still, which is one of the largest employers already in the United States.
So more teachers, although AI can replace teachers. Why shouldn't a smart machine replace a teacher any more than a smart machine replace a lawyer?
Because I think it's possible they could, but I do think that may be a Guinan area, that people are still going to want to have human beings involved, including with the law, for example. We've seen AI involved in the law in a very significant way, but I still think that there's going to be a desire to have human lawyers, human judges. So there's industries like that we have to see. So the argument here is not don't subsidize starving people. Obviously, we are going to be giving some type of living wage to a large population. But what we have to look at is how that affects politically the relationship of citizens to their government, and how we can preserve the sense of productivity, individuality that citizens need to feel fully human.
What about the Tocquevillian analysis of revolution, Jonathan, that people get angriest, not when they're at their poorest or when they're suffering the most, but actually when they're a little better off? Is rage rational?
Well, rage can't be rational. It's also very subjective, right? It's your rage is righteous, their rage is dangerous. I've been a legal analyst for 4 networks for 30 years, CBS, NBC, BBC, and Fox recently. And I've always seen rage on both sides. And there's always a reason for it. That's the thing about rage. It's what rage unleashes that can become dangerous if it's not controlled. And that's what Madison and others tried to do. Did very well, I think. It's what the French failed to do with their early constitutions. So we have to look at that. And we also have to preserve what I call a liberty-enhancing economy. That, yes, we're going to have to subsidize a large population of unemployed people. And many of those individuals, because of their age, we have to accept are probably not going to be employed again. But we have to be able to use these years to try to prepare for that. We just can't just cut them checks. We have to look at the implications politically and socially for people who are kept in that sense.
So your solution isn't not so much legal, even if you're a legal analyst, it's economic and political. Are there models of this? Are you really calling for a digital New Deal? Is FDR the model here?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that what we do have to do is to try to preserve capitalistic elements, to allow people to...
So where's the model then? I take your point. If you're not falling back on FDR, I'm not sure Paine would be particularly helpful here, or even Madison or Jefferson. Where's the model in American history? Who addressed this issue in a way that you think we can learn from? Or is it so new that we're going to need to invent new political ideas and politicians?
I'm not sure we'll need new political ideas as much as retooling the ideas we had at the beginning of the revolution. We have a system that is designed to deal with these types of pressures, but we are going to have a mix of social programs, things like a living wage. We're going to have to be nimble. It means that we're going to have to accept that many industries are going to be robotic or changed by AI. We are going to have to try to encourage people to go into those more homocentric industries. I think education will be...
encourage, what exactly does that mean? Are they being paid to do it? Are they being forced to do it?
No, it's to the degree that the government favors new industries. It should be, in fact, new industries, not subsidizing failing industries. But also there's a lot of education that the government can help here in directing people who want to be employed into areas where there is greater potential for that employment. What you don't want is to have this sort of path dependence where you have people training for jobs that simply won't be there, right? If you are, training to be a radiologist today, I'm afraid that's a bit of a mistake. And you have to...
Well, their government never really knows. Who knows whether radiologists or lawyers or engineers or politicians or law professors... it sounds to me, Jonathan, finally, that your ideal state, I know you're not a big fan of the EU, but there is a kind of technocratic enlightenment fantasy that you have of government, may not be quite the EU, but it's Danish or German, smart state trying to push people into industries that are relevant for the future rather than the past. You're certainly not a MAGA person, you're not a nostalgist, but is there a kind of government, maybe the Chinese or the Korean or the Danish that suits your vision of the future? Who's getting it right?
No, I actually think the American Republic actually offers the best structure here. And I don't think it's just the government's job. When I talk about educating people, it's going to be a job of society. It's going to be our trying to direct these discussions into areas where people can be productive, can be self-expressive. The EU is not the model. In fact, the book goes into how all rights, like politics, are local, and we have to support the sort of decentralization of politics. It's the centralization of power that I'm worried about in groups like the EU, because I think that the EU is inherently unstable.
Well, there you have it. Excellent conversation by GW, professor of law, and new book, Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. One thing's for sure, it is indeed an unfinished story. Jonathan Turley, congratulations on the new book, and thank you for a fascinating conversation.